Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome from us here at ASBN to our second episode of Talking Up Africa on Africa's energy future. My name is Belinda Williams, and I'm the stakeholder manager here at the Africa Scotland Business Network. Today, we are broadcasting live from Bowmans law firm in South Africa. Thanks to our wonderful member company for hosting us today. We really appreciate that. Thank you also to our member companies from all over the world who have tuned in today. We are delighted to have you. We are also happy to welcome new participants into this session. And this is going to be a really fantastic event. I'm looking forward to it. So without further ado, we are delighted to welcome another stellar lineup of guest speakers as we unpack the topic of Africa's energy future. I'd just like to say a special thank you to Stephanie, who is moderating this session. Stephanie is an international commercial lawyer, and she's also ASBN's non-exec director. Let me introduce our guest speakers. Today, we've got Lamé Vera from Leaning Equity and Sustainability, also SSE Renewables. We've got Paul Sinclair, VP for Hive Group PLC. We've got Samson Barrymore from Platinum Samandi. We'd also like to welcome Ryan McPherson from the Energy Industries Council, and also James Cumming from African Clean Energy Developments. Thanks again for joining us. Warm welcome from all of us here at ASBN. And Stephanie, I now hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Belinda, and good afternoon to everybody from here in Cape Town. I'm sharing an office today with James Cumming, and our other panel members are dotted around the world. We've got Samson, who's calling us from Nigeria. We've got Lamé and hopefully Paul, if he manages to log in, who are joining us from the UK. And then we've got Ryan, who's in the Middle East, although very much a Scotsman, as you will discover when he gets a chance to speak. So delighted to be here with you again today. For those of you who were at the first episode, you will recall that we chatted about the impact of the Ukraine war on the African continent. And of course, a big part of that debate was what's happening in the energy sector here. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that topic got the most attention out of all of the topics that we looked at in that first episode. And so today we're going to focus in more detail at the broader picture on the energy landscape here in Africa. And we're going to ask ourselves the question, based on our own experiences of doing business here in Africa or supporting others to do so, what does the energy transition mean for Africa? And looking at that from where we stand today and the unique challenges that the African continent has, and what does it mean for the future, both in terms of the opportunities and the obstacles that we are likely to face. And I think it's a great thing that we've got such a diverse panel today, because hopefully we will get a bit of debate going on what is obviously a very topical issue, not just here in Africa at the moment, but very much across the world. So let's start, if you don't mind, Lamé, we're going to start with you. And what I'd like is, if you can, please, for participants, give us a scene setter. What does the energy transition mean for Africa based on your experience and your views? And perhaps comparing the situation we have here to the situation that other more developed nations or regions in the world might face. What are the unique challenges that we have here in Africa? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. I think from my perspective, the first question is transitioning from what to what, right? So when we're talking about the energy transition, we're saying we need to stop one thing and then move on to a second thing. So within the African context, we know that 600 million people by the end of the decade will not have access to clean, reliable, non-affordable energy, and therefore leaving them in energy poverty when you think about the S in ESG, just doesn't make sense. So how do you leverage the existing resources in a decarbonized way to save the population, while also in the meantime building up the transition to other energy mix, right? So it's not moving from one to another. It's about creating a new energy mix that works for Africa, but that is decarbonized and also helps us to meet the net zero ambition. So that's kind of my perspective, being from the continent and also living in the global north. So I'm able to see those two disparity. And if you think about the countries that are currently experiencing climate change, they're probably the ones that have contributed the least to the emissions. So it's a reduction of fossil fuel in the global north while we decarbonize the global south, but making sure that people have access to energy, because we need to really balance out that energy trilemma.
Yeah, and of course, excuse me, as you mentioned, a significant amount of people here in Africa have virtually no access to energy from their homes at the moment. So I think on average, it's somewhere close to 50% of the population here. And so some would say in some countries in Africa, this energy transition is actually from a standing start. And I wondered if you might just talk a little bit more, and particularly because I know you have a very strong experience in the ESG side of this debate. How do you feel about, and what are you seeing in Africa in terms of the need to go through this energy transition, but in a way that ensures economic sustainability, in a way that protects the jobs that are here and creates opportunities for further job creation, and ultimately ensuring that it's done in a way that people can get access to energy, can get access to jobs, and can have a better quality of life.
Yeah, I think to the point when we talk about the ESG or the sustainability element, why we say is the triple bottom line is people, purpose, and profit. So we kind of pursue the purpose bit and the profit bit and leave the people side, right? So that's the S. And I think from my perspective, it's about decarbonizing the sector rather than shutting it down. And I think that's where the conversation sometimes is not very clear between what the requirements are to achieve net zero globally versus the need of an emerging continent that has also the youngest population in the world who are going to be hungry for energy. And how do we meet that need, but balancing the global requirements? So I think that's where some of the conversation is also not very, I will use the word skewed a little bit, because it's sometimes sounds like it's one-sided. And I think it needs to be balance. And if you think about the needs of the global north around moving to renewable energy, we also have to remember that all the renewable technologies are underpinned by a completely different sector called mining. And how do you make sure that that is also sustainable, and those materials, in front of the supply of the materials to meet the needs of the renewable generation growth across all the different technologies will be very paramount as well. And a continent that has the youngest population, 600 million without access to energy, we will need to find a way to feed that. And then we think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So we're starting from the bottom of those needs, and we need to build that up. You can't start from the top of the pyramid, otherwise the pyramid will not stand. So you've got to build the base and then kind of work our way up to self-actualization. So I think from my perspective, the conversation needs to be a bit more balanced, but I think the continent also has an imperative to own their own narrative at some point, because otherwise we're kind of waiting for the narrative to be shaped and then we're just going to follow on. But I think it's not going to work. And so owning that narrative, being part of the solution, definitely recognizing the need to decarbonize, and it's not just the energy sector, to decarbonize the continent as we grow and develop to get the needs of the people met. And then also ensuring that, okay, we know what we need to do, we know how we're going to do it. Then the last two questions, who's going to do it and who's going to pay for it, right? And those are the questions that are still not answered at the moment. And then coming back to the who's going to do it, and I will stop on that point, is that when you think about the current energy system of fossil fuel and oil and gas, that whole sector creates jobs. And there's an ecosystem around it that serves people. And then when you go to the renewable technologies, all the manufacturing is going to be done outside, and then only the installation. So you're going to lose a lot of jobs. And so where do you transfer those jobs from and to what? And so that's the other piece of the equation that I think when you take that S in ESG perspective of people, we have to start thinking about them very, very critically and making sure that we are solving for all of those elements and not just some of it.
Yeah, all great points. And if I could just go in briefly on the comment you made about the fact that, of course, there are a number of countries here in Africa that have big export business in the minerals required to manufacture components for renewables technologies like batteries and wind turbines, etc. And of course, that in itself creates jobs and it creates money. I know there's a side debate about the working conditions for those who are in that industry, and maybe we can discuss on that later. But so those guys are already working, and of course we want to maintain jobs. But isn't there also an opportunity there to grow that market, in the sense that at the moment the minerals are coming out of the ground and they're going overseas, and somebody else is doing the manufacturing?
Yeah.
If we could find a way to have manufacturing right here on our doorstep, and extend the supply chain, extend the value chain so that it's happening here on the ground, that must surely create more job opportunities and more investment for the region.
And that's very correct. So there are people already working in the sector in the front end of renewables in the mines, but those are not the premium jobs. Those are not the high value roles. And so how do you bring those manufacturing back onto the continent, which means that somebody needs to make that investment and you need to build the plants, and that will create jobs. So at the moment, those investments have been done elsewhere. And therefore there is that transition of the earth minerals out of the continent to produce the technologies, and then that's brought back at a premium that the continent now needs to pay for. So I think it's about working hand in hand in terms of where are the needs, how do we localize that manufacturing and that insourcing. So really building the creation of the energy access that is localized to the people, but also to the source, because also think about it across the continent. If you want to start to build grid infrastructure to get electricity to all and sundry, it's probably going to be impossible. It's a mammoth task. So how do we start looking at, off-grid solutions, microgrid generations, localized solutions, but really meeting the needs of communities where they're at, and not kind of looking at this cookie cutter approach in terms of this is what we're doing elsewhere. Bringing that back and localizing the solution, knowing exactly what we need to achieve, and then bringing jobs back onto the continent. Like I said, it's the youngest continent on the planet, so we need to engage those people, right? They need to have economic viability, they need to be empowered, and they need energy. And energy, from my perspective, and when you just look at it from even a gender perspective, is when you have access to energy, it creates empowerment, but mostly for women and children, because when you think about clean water and clean cooking, it's the women of those communities that have to go get those sources in order to even get the day started, right? So it's so for me, from this whole energy transition and the African continent, I look at it from the lens of the S in ESG, because it's really about people, and that's what it comes down to for me.
Brilliant, thanks, Lami. That was an excellent overview. And a couple of those points I'd like to revisit, particularly when I chat to Ryan and James a bit later. So if you don't mind, Paul, I see Paul's managed to log in. Hi, Paul. Glad to see you. If you don't mind, I'm actually going to jump to Samson next. Samson, apologies, I'm pulling this one on you at the last minute. But the reason for that is because I think a few of the things that Lami has talked about will perhaps be of particular relevance to you. And I know that you're based in West Africa and you've got a very deep experience in oil and gas in Africa. And I'm wondering how you feel about the energy transition and what people are talking about in West Africa when it comes to the energy transition, particularly given that there is such a heavy reliance on fossil fuel exports from that part of the continent.
Is the question for me?
Yes, that's your introduction.
Okay, yeah. Well, from my experience as someone that is in the oil and gas industry here, I do believe Africa, when it comes to the sustainability here and the climate change, Africa is one of the regions that is mostly affected by the climate disorders. and for us to be able to get these done, we have to play the leading role in whatever we need to do to be able to get it going. Meaning that we have a lot of resources here. We have mineral resources, we have potential resources that anywhere you go around the world, they don't even have as much as Africa has. However, how can we do this? The only way for us to get this done will be for us to be able to get the outside countries involved, to be able to help us get through this. Because not to even talk of even the problem we're going through now with our energy, half of the people in Africa are not even having sufficient, power to be able to live off of. For example, if you talk about Nigeria, you talk about Ghana, you talk about some other countries in Africa, we're already suffering the energy, even though we have a lot of resources, that other countries are coming to come and drill oil from our country, but yet we're still having the problem. So how can we achieve this climate change that we want to do? Because we're already suffering the climate disorder here. So for us to be able to do that, we're going to need the help of the foreign countries to be able to help us through. And that would be my own opinion from someone that is in the oil and gas business. So for us to be able to transition into that, we have a long way to go. That's just the reality.
Yeah, and from the perspective of the oil and gas industry there in West Africa and the players, the guys who are, making things happen in that industry, what are you seeing in terms of their adaptation, if anything, towards a decarbonized future? Are they feeling the pressure of that? Are they taking steps to evolve their businesses to respond?
Well, definitely, yes. They are feeling the pressure, and I get those questions everywhere I go. Sometimes when I go visit some of the companies that we actually do work with out of the country, they do ask me about, okay, what do you think about this climate change? What do you think about the sustainability? What do you think is going to happen if we don't use the oil anymore? Because you in particular, you are in the oil and gas business. Yes, the oil and gas business are under the pressure, but the pressure, it's not really too much on them because they know it's going to take a while for anything to happen, which I agree with them. And living in the USA and coming to Africa and then being able to travel all around the world as well, I know it's going to take a while for that to happen. So yes, they are feeling the pressure, but they don't really care too much about the pressure. That is the feelings I get from the oil and gas companies that we deal with, whether Chevron, Shell, ExxonMobil, and Total. Those are the four major oil companies.
And your comment earlier about the need to get support from the rest of the world to help Africa to transition, and that must surely also involve, of course, the need for finance. Do you have any views, Samson, on what we here in Africa need to do to make the investment landscape look attractive for those who are currently investing in other renewables markets around the world? We're, in a way, what we're doing is competing for that capital. And some would say that, there are countries in the world and regions in the world where you can invest perhaps more easily and with less risk. Do you have any views about that?
What I think we need to do, having to be running business here compared to running business in the US and other part of the globe. What I think Africa needs to do is we need to be ready, because most of the time we are not actually ready. Because most of the African countries is colonized by different countries, and then we become like a colony. We are under the different colonies. We need to get our mindset off of that. We need to be ready on our own. We need to know that we are ready to go, rather than us relenting on the effort of the foreign countries to come and take advantage of what we have. Because right now, what I'm noticing here, compared to where we have other offices, is we just let the other foreign companies come to Africa and take advantage of all the mineral resources and everything that we have, rather than for us to make the effort to be able to focus and say, okay, what do we do to transition? What do we need to do to take over this? It's just like what I do in Nigeria in the oil and gas. What I do is I try to transition from anything we deal with, all the clients that we deal with, whether Chevron, ExxonMobil, I try to transition that into the local guys to make sure that we equip our guys in what they need to do. And I think that's what generally Africa needs to do when it comes to this transition. We all need to be ready. We all need to know that we're ready to go. And then we need to have good governments. We need to have people that have the heart of people, you know, going into the government, not just anybody anyhow, you know, for either, you know, for their own selfish purpose, but people that are ready, you know, to be able to serve the country and be able to look after the whole entire continent of Africa.
Yeah, for sure. And that is an ongoing problem for us here in the continent. If I could just turn to James here in the room in Cape Town for a moment, because I know from a South African point of view, this issue of ensuring that there is, you know, something in it for the local market. There's sort of buy local policies that have been promoted, very much promoted in South Africa in recent times, and in your experience in renewables. How do you think that's going, James? Do you think they're making progress? Is there some success stories out there?
There are two sort of aspects to it. One is kind of local content and procurement, and the other is capital. On the local content and procurement front, in the government-run program for procuring renewables from the private sector, the Renewable Energy Independent Procurement process, or REAP as it's called, the particular rules we as IPPs and developers have to adhere to, sort of minimum thresholds and targets, and all of that flows into whether or not you win a bid. It becomes part of your scoring. And they do that based on an assessment of percentage of spend locally. We typically find that we're able to do very well on the balance of plant contracts. So all of the electrical balance of plant and civil balance of plant contracts can be done almost entirely locally.
Yeah.
Where it becomes tricky is supply of modules and PV, and supply of turbines in wind, and indeed hydro. While government have tried to provide enough certainty in the market for tower manufacturers or turbine suppliers to establish local manufacturing, it really hasn't been enough of a golden thread for the OEMs to invest here. So we've had tower manufacturers establish themselves here, but then close up shop. Now they've opened up again, but they have very limited capacity. Similar thing with module suppliers. Set up shop, had to close, and now they've opened up again. I think the policy framework is good, and it's poised to work in the medium term. Now that we're seeing this massive boom in renewables, but and this speaks to Samson's point on leadership. There was a 4 or 5 year hiatus on renewables procurement purely because of poor leadership in the country, and because of that poor leadership, we have less local manufacturing, and we have a power crisis. I mean, one component of the power crisis. It's accentuated by that pause. So I think it's probably something that will sort itself out, and we'll see more tower manufacturers and maybe blade manufacturers, PV module manufacturers. Whether or not they can get up to the scale that's required in South Africa remains to be seen. I mean, there's a huge amount on the go.
Yeah.
And then on the capital front, no problems there. There's tons of South African capital available. There's almost a race to the bottom. It's highly competitive, and so from a local ownership perspective and a local capital perspective, I think government's done the right thing, South African business has done the right thing. They're available, agile, and are investing in renewables in a massive way, either as much, if not more so, than foreign.
Yeah, and actually that was going to be my next question. Do you think that there's a lot of capital available for these projects because it's local capital and people understand the markets here and they understand the risks and the players and the regulatory framework? Does that make it easier for them to put their money behind the projects and the program than it is for foreign investors?
To a certain extent, I mean, in the recent procurement rounds and in the advent of the commercial and industrial offtake market, there's been a huge amount of foreign capital inflow. I think this is a fact, but forgive me if I'm wrong. It might not apply to every single round, but in the years where a renewables procurement round has closed, it's been the largest source of foreign direct investment. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that it's crowding out local. There was a time where that was the case, but to a certain degree, but it's not the case anymore. I think, foreign capital is now well versed in how to invest in a renewables project, and a renewables project is a renewables project is a renewables project. Really, in South Africa, well, I mean, the program is run on the back of probably a decade of programs prior to, and cherry picked in a very commendable way by the department the best aspects of those tenders elsewhere. So I think it's been easy for foreign capital to understand the local market from a kind of project finance technology perspective. Yeah. The local content, economic affirmative action policies have been harder to get their heads around, but typically, you have to invest alongside a local partner, and that almost by default entails a hand-holding process. Yeah. What we're seeing most recently is, some sources of foreign capital just coming in and actually shooting the lights out. And if there weren't these limitations on how much could be foreign owned, you might see that crowding it out entirely. Right.
So, I mean, that's a good positive signal, isn't it? That if South Africa can still attract that much foreign investment, notwithstanding the challenges that we have here, then, it's possible for other countries and other regions here. And yet, in the SADC region, it seems South Africa is way ahead. But maybe we come back to that. I'd like now, if I may, to go to Ryan, who's in the Middle East, and Ryan's at the Energy Industries Council, and I think it would be interesting for everyone to hear, Ryan, well, first of all, about EIC and who you are and what you do, but also just to get more of a global stance on what people are saying and doing about the energy transition, and then to compare that with some of the challenges we've been discussing in the African context so far today.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you very much to Claire and Belinda from ASBN for the invite today. As you mentioned, I'm based across in Abu Dhabi. I've been here now for over 12 years, but as you'll hear from the accent, still have that strong Scottish twang. So the Energy Industries Council is an 80-year-old organisation, or will be 80 years old in a few months' time. And as the name suggests, it's encompassing all energy. So that is your traditional oil and gas, your power, nuclear, renewables, solar, onshore, offshore wind, nuclear, etc. And we're the UK's largest trade association with almost 800 members. In essence, what we do is help our members to understand and win business in export markets. And we do that through a number of ways. One is through the provision of market intelligence data. We have proprietary systems. Some are through the large-scale events that you will see, where we will put on a UK pavilion to bring the best and brightest of the UK supply chain capability. So places like OTC in Houston, ADIPEC, the world's largest energy show, which is just taking place in my town here of Abu Dhabi and offshore Europe. But we'll also do things like trade delegations, particularly into Africa. That's a really important thing that we'll do, bringing UK companies in. And then smaller scale events that are networking to help, not just the networking element, but enhance knowledge fractions so that people are aware what's happening in the industry, who the key players are, and in many cases, just putting them in front of the key decision makers. So it's as much as a facilitation service. I'm one of the regional directors, and I have probably the largest geographical remit to look after. So Middle East, Africa, CIS. Africa was in a continent that I inherited that I'd never worked in prior to joining EIC 4 years ago. So I'd got extensive experience across Europe, the Middle East, where I'd been based for a number of years, and Asia Pac, where I'd looked after in previous roles. So Africa, for me, was very interesting and still continues to be. But every time I spend more time there, I realize that my knowledge base needs to increase because there's so much happening. And as one of our members pointed out, well, it's 54 different countries and 54 different cultures, different nuances, different ideas that you're dealing with. So I've kind of realized that element. In terms of what we are seeing, Stephanie, in energy transition, I think this is something it's not new, but it certainly it sounds it to many people. It's now became into the mainstream. It's no longer a C-suite discussion. This is, you walk down the street, anyone and everyone will know what's happening in the energy sector and what's happening with the energy transitions. The COPs have done a good bit to enhance the knowledge base, and it's covering all demographics. So you would talk to younger people and they would know that as well. It's creating significant opportunity, but also challenge in the way that certain different countries have adopted this. And I think the speed and urgency and scale that we've looked to do this. Lamé made a very valid point at the outset, talking about, well, transition from what? Because there isn't one particular transition that we would say, right, it's binary. And what I mean from that is stop using oil and gas and moving to solar. And I think we've accepted that can't be done. As an industry, we're maybe unique. If you're looking at hydrocarbon industry, you know what's going to displace you. Straight away, we know what's coming to displace hydrocarbons in a larger percentage term in, let's argue, 30, 40, 50. We could carry on with that, but certainly probably not in my career here. But we know what's coming, and there's a large amount of transition from people. When I say it's not binary, I look at the Middle East here, if I may, and they've taken quite a nice tack, an open, transparent tack, where on the eve of ADIPEC, we had the phrase from the CEO of ADNOC, the national oil company here. It's maximize production, minimize emissions. So basically, it's saying the whole size of the prize has now got bigger, but we're going to play in both. So we are unashamedly going to increase production. And here they're going to do that at the lowest carbon footprint. A lot of the hydrocarbons are onshore, so they can do that. But we will minimize emissions. And that is not just in the oil and gas sector, but actually we will take some of the money we're making from the hydrocarbons and put that into renewables. So you've got your three largest solar parks here in the UAE. There are huge projects in hydrogen, in wind. So right across the Middle East, the GCC, you're seeing that. So, and that's kind of been accepted. But what I found was, and this is just my view, in coming into Africa, there was more of a sense that you need to move away from gas immediately and start getting into the renewables and ramping that up. And I think we've seen not that long ago, countries embark on a decade of gas. There's a huge amount of infrastructure that's been heavily invested in the oil and gas sector. You can't just do away with that. There's the jobs, the employment that it's currently creating. And I think when I attended the Africa Oil Week and Green Energy Africa Summit last month, that was the main thing that came out from me, that the passion that was there. It's not saying we don't want to transition. It's we will transition at a pace that suits the country or the continent here. And it shouldn't be up to outside influences to say, no, this is the pace you're going to go at, because that's where we're looking at. I think everyone's talked about the poverty element. You're actually in danger if you do the transition a lot quicker in making some companies bankrupt because they maybe aren't able to adapt as quick. But also, I think it's maybe mentioned, if not, it's worth echoing that Africa itself is contributing less than 4% of the global GHG emissions. And I think that's an important part. So I think the energy transition is a great topic, and you could talk for it for hours. I think it's the case of a just transition, and each country will go at their own pace, has their own targets. I think if we're all on that journey, because it's not a race, whoever coined the phrase race to net zero, I think the marketing team should have had a look at that, because whoever wins or gets there first doesn't win. We all win when we come over the line at whatever pace that is. It's about finishing, not when you finish. It's about finishing.
Yeah, really interesting views, and it's great to be able to compare with what's happening there in the industry in the Middle East and hear about that firsthand. So thank you, Ryan. I'm wondering if you might just share with participants what you've learned from your own members, those at least who have come to Africa and done projects here, invested here, or have looked at doing so, have investigated doing so. What kind of feedback have you had from your members as to what people found here in Africa, pros and cons of this market versus other markets, if that's okay?
Sure. So let me say, first of all, Africa is a buoyant market. The data shows that for the next 5+ years, the industry as a whole is making up for lost time. We were actually in a bit of a downturn pre-COVID, so COVID just emphasized that. And you're starting to see a lot of projects at what we would call FID, financial investment decision, across Africa, both in the oil and gas, the hydrocarbon, and in your renewable sector. Egypt, who have just hosted COP27, have announced a huge amount of hydrogen projects. So let me first of all say there is a wealth of opportunity of projects across the African continent. And as a result, that gets people interested. But I think you alluded to this earlier, Stephanie, it's a competitive market. So not every company can afford to say, we're going to go into Saudi, we're going to go into the UAE, we're going to go into Africa, we're going to go into the US, we're going to go into KL. They can't do everything. So you have to then assess where you're going to get the biggest return on investment, or where there's a degree of longevity. And I think that's where we find, or through our members, that Africa still remains challenging in the sense that it has not been fully utilized. I mentioned earlier we will do trade missions. So we get a lot of companies that will come out to your countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Mozambique, Senegal. Very interesting conversations are had. They're having these similar conversations in other countries that I mentioned, but they aren't always then going ahead with enhancing their business there. So it's been the case, they've done a bit of fact finding, but we would like to see more companies embark on that journey. And I think the challenges sometimes are understanding where the win-win is. So the idea that you can't just come in, I think, to any country and just sell a product and leave now. There are two things, we've touched on them already. One is the local manufacturing. So you're going to be looking for that almost in any country now. And if it's not, it's coming, believe me. The second one is the knowledge transfer. So there is an expectation that you will have to transfer some knowledge, capability, learning to the local workforce. So if you go in with that, and the other side of the equation understands this as well, I think there's more opportunity. unfortunately, sometimes this breaks down very, very early on, where it's viewed that actually, as much as I could make X on this, the downside is far more. I could actually lose X, or I'm going to get tied into a partnership that I just don't feel is right. So what happens invariably is the communication breaks down, said company goes to another market and invests the money there. Now, what you're finding is, particularly for UK companies, there's a wealth of knowledge there, and there are various ways in which companies are expanding their business. And one is diversification. So they're maybe going from traditional hydrocarbons into the energy transition, be it in any form of renewables. But one of the other main things, and will continue to be, as the UK is a declining basin, is export. So they're looking at export markets for skills and products. And Africa should sit high up there, and it doesn't. And I don't know whether it's just not been marketed well, the fact that the communication breaks down so early. It's something I'm desperate to change. We will be looking to take more delegations in, working with companies like ASBN to break down some of these barriers. But at the moment, the challenges still remain here. And I am unfortunately seeing other countries that are probably getting more benefit than those across the African continent. So I think there is an imbalance there, but the opportunity is definitely there.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's a frustrating state of affairs, isn't it? And James, you were mentioning to me earlier about the capacity issues that we're having here in the South African market within the contracting and the supply chain. Do you want to just share a few insights on that? Because it's a really interesting debate to have, when on the one hand, Ryan is saying the guys in the UK are looking for export markets, they've got the skills, they've got the knowledge, they want to come and invest elsewhere, and yet Africa is just not getting these people and these products. So what's happening? Why is that not the case?
Yeah, it's a strange phenomenon, and it's flipped quite recently, and it's been with the sudden kind of change in regulation in the country, where government has basically said, just take care of bringing generation onto the grid as fast as you can, private sector, please now. And that's part of South Africa's transition, on top of the globe, or other areas of the globe being in a similar sort of space. There's just a limited capacity of contractors, a limited capacity of skills, and this heightened competition for even just being able to get your turbines and modules to country on time, or transformers if they're built overseas or even locally. The market has flipped from being something we would quite enjoy as an IPP on the buy side of things, having a very rigorous and competitive process to ensure the best kind of levelized cost of energy or highest return, to now contractors saying, I'm fully utilized, even if I did have the capacity, I can't overextend my balance sheet any further because I just won't be able to provide you the bonding. And you would think that that means there's a sufficient opportunity for everyone to scale up, or for foreign companies to move in, but we're just not seeing that yet. If anything, some of the international companies that do have presence here are so busy elsewhere that they can't give us the attention we want. So it's somewhat of a plea, I suppose. If you can build a PV park or a wind farm, we're open for business. And at the same time, I think from a government perspective, even from and it's a delicate topic and hard to manage, but from a human resources perspective, there's just a shortage of of skills. That's not to say they don't exist here. The skills are here, but just in terms of skill count, sort of, the absolute value of the number of people that can do the job required to get projects online is lacking locally.
Yeah. Paul, I'm wondering if Paul is still with us, because he's not on my screen. There he is.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
I haven't forgotten about you. I was just wondering whether you had dropped off, but I'm glad to see you're still here. So I'm sure you've been listening in on all the issues we've been discussing so far. I wondered if you might share some views with the group on, where you think governments and industry players are focusing their attention on African energy markets at the moment in terms of energy mix and technology, and even regions and countries. Where are the focal points, and where do you think we're going to see the most growth in terms of both energy project development as well as the infrastructure that we need to enable that? Because one of the things I don't think we've touched on yet today, is the fact that it's all very well to try to procure renewable energy projects, but if you don't have the transmission infrastructure to support it, then you've got a big problem. And that is definitely one of the challenges that we have here in Africa. So yeah, any insights from your side, Paul, on that? I know you spend a lot of your time working alongside a whole variety of stakeholders in this industry, from government down to industry players.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big topic, isn't it? Like the global energy transition, then the African energy transition, and then the energy transition I think Ryan alluded to for 54 states. And it's almost impossible to have a broad conversation like this because there's so many variables depending on who's speaking. So if you look at the sentiment coming from African leaders, which people may or may not agree with, is why are we talking about the energy transition when we're only 3% emitters? We haven't utilized all of our oil and gas, where Western communities have utilized, industrialized, gone forward, damaged the economy. Where's the reparations? Where are we thinking about this logically, where we haven't been in a position to actually utilize and monetize our own natural resources at this stage? Not only that, we're a low carbon emitter, and you can't get China, India, and the high emitters to even commit to any sort of mandate moving forward, as we've just seen coming out of Egypt, or very insignificant commitments. So when you've got South Africa, that's a huge producer of coal, why are we talking about the energy transition in South Africa to the extent that we are? For example, I'm not saying that this is my view, but this is the sort of feedback you get from industry, when coal is still being sold to the international markets and we can still generate sovereign guarantees from it, for example. Whilst we're on the energy transition, what is the energy transition? The word transition by its own definition is moving from one to another, yet the world is focused solely on, or very highly, and rightly so because of climate change, on renewable energy. And there's a lot of sentiment around the industry is if we're not looking at peak oil until 2040, 2050, why can't Africa play its role in being a supply base of choice with reinforced carbon management strategies where you're decarbonising infrastructure or reducing carbon emissions through the development of oil and gas? Why are we not able, with undiversified economies, why are we not able to carry on with the development of the African oil and gas upstream when there's still demand internationally? And then you go on to things like, how do you create regional oil and gas markets? Lame entered the conversation with the 600 million people without reliable energy access to power, liquid fuels, regional energy markets. So is gas now, England was no to fossil fuels. Then with the Ukraine crisis came back to saying, gas is okay. Gas is okay. A few countries have come back to say, don't mind coal as well if prices are spiraling. So it all seems to be at the pace of the international market, let alone this highly diverse continent, you know, we all call home, which is Africa. So I think then when you move that conversation on, you're looking at what Ryan is saying, 54 countries on a different evolution. You know, how can you compare relatively mature markets like Morocco or Senegal with regards to renewable energy? How can you define an energy transition strategy from ivory towers in the West, when you're including Africa in the conversation? You're including perhaps less mature energy markets like, say, Burundi or Malawi or somewhere else. So to have this broad conversation, it's not one shoe fits all, I think, is the general feeling. And when you talk about the transition, you go from a heavy oil and gas into a balanced energy mix, into what we all hope for the sake of the future of the globe, you know, relatively, net zero or dependent on renewable energy. But what's that phase in the middle? What does it look like? How do we create competitive markets through strong regulation? Perhaps, utilities which have got better credit worthiness for off-takers for renewable power, infrastructure. What's the point? You know, I was helping in a project in West Africa in a country where 80% of the energy was created by through biomass and wood. Yet they were talking about putting 400 megawatts of LNG into the country and developing an LNG hub. But there's no infrastructure aside from the new transmission line in West Africa, which has its own challenges into actually doing that. So there's so many different variables. There's the emotive, there's the energy transition from end to end, there's the evolution of each country. And what we aim to do, not dissimilar to what Ryan is saying, is trying to give a spotlight to drive the social and economic development of the continent through capital deployment into projects, irrespective of whether they're fossil or whether they're renewable energy, to create job creation, localization, wealth, energy access. And I think there's still an argument that we should be talking about the energy transition, inclusive of fossil fuels. If you look at CCUS and other things, there's new technology on the market which can reduce the carbon footprint on low carbon barrels. So how do we keep Africa relevant on the oil and gas discussion by implementing strong carbon management strategies, so we can utilize our oil and gas, so we can create sovereign receipts, so we can re-inject that capital back into developing middle income economies, whilst also exploring creating a competitive landscape for our renewable energy, and reducing the energy deficit through greener or green technologies as well, whether that's hydrogen, solar, or whatever. And I think that hopefully, I mean, it's hard in 5 minutes, let alone the whole hour. That's, I guess, my thoughts are shaped on what I hear from stakeholders, both public and private sector. And I think that's really the sentiment coming from the African public sector, is we should be given the right to develop our fossil fuels, but notwithstanding respect that we all want, a cleaner environment. And what are those policies, and working with the private sector internationally to create that environment to ensure we accelerate the rate of renewable energy coming onto the grid. So I don't know if that gives a summary of my thinking and perhaps our stakeholders' thinking.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Paul. Thank you very much. A really interesting overview. And I wanted to just ask you, picking up on something that Samson said earlier about his experience in West Africa, around how the oil and gas industry are adapting or not to the energy transition. And I think what Samson said was that there's a lot of noise about that, but the pace is very slow because people feel that actually there's a long time to go. And I wondered, is that also what you're seeing? I mean, you mentioned the example of the biomass project, but in terms of energy mix in West Africa specifically, are you seeing any real changes there, or do you also agree that it's a slow burn?
I think governments are at the mercy of their electorate, and people want access to power. They want to see social and economic change. And whilst you do have undiversified economies, rightly or wrongly, some people are doing it better, and it's not to Africa, it's across the world. When you've got a resource which is going to create receipts, and enable you to grow your economy, that is going to be your primary concern. And when you haven't got the viability of looking at quickly accelerating agriculture, financial services, and all of the other portfolios that would sit under your, sit within your economy. If, for example, Cote d'Ivoire has just found a huge discovery offshore with Eni, from a very human perspective, your focus is going to be on developing that natural resource to develop your pot. I think that's normal to accept from anyone. So, yeah, I think Africa's very cognizant. If you can talk about 1-2 billion people with a brush, very mindful, very very much committed to finding alternative power sources to accelerate their economies. But equally, when there's a resource there, why leave them stranded? Is if you can do it in a sustainable and responsible way that contributes to global demand. And global demand will always be the dictator of how much resource you really want to exploit, isn't it? Same in the mining sector, same as anywhere else. So I would say there would probably remain to be a commitment to fossil fuels, knowing that there is an alternative to reduce the energy deficit via renewable energy, and why not look at that as well?
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul. Those really interesting views. I got a question from the audience for Samson, and this is from the Geothermal Association. And the question is, how do we develop a scheme or methodologies that would encourage the majors across the energy sector to knowledge transfer and support capacity building with their African partners and counterparts that would enable Africa at a local, national and continental scale to be ready and take the lead?
Africa is there are so many opportunities for Africa as a continent to be able to bypass the fuels and the infrastructure that we have in place now and be able to move into the sustainable energy system. However, we have a potential role to play by ourselves. And the potential role that we need to play as the world energy transition to a net zero, continent. So whereby we need to attract the necessary investment. The same way we attracted the necessary investment to be able to come in with the IOCs and start drilling in Africa, whether you talk about it, Cosmos, Tullow, Shell, Mobil, Total, the same way we attracted them in the beginning, we still need to do the same thing if we really want to do that. And then we'll be able to transition into local content and we'll be able to move people into that area. Think about it. For example, some of these advanced countries like in the USA, we already have electric vehicles. And a lot of people are getting incentives for buying electric vehicles to be able to, because this is part of the transition. If United States is now making that happen to say, okay, you know what, if you buy Tesla or you buy electric vehicle, you're going to get this incentive. These are the things that we need to attract to be able to move all these things into the local content level. And it's the same way we're doing it with oil and gas now, because how do we transition our guys, our people, and people like me that left United States to come to Nigeria or come to Africa to say, I want to invest in my country. So that is the only way I think we can do that. We need to attract the necessary investment.
Okay, thank you, Samson. I think we're coming up against our time constraints now. I wonder if we might just go around the group and just ask for some very brief closing comments. And I'll start with James here in Cape Town.
It's always interesting for someone very firmly in the renewable space to hear input, thoughts coming out of oil and gas. I guess I think that's the something we need to as a continent, and I agree completely with Paul and Ryan, everyone. I'm sure it's always overly simplistic to just call it one place, because it isn't. But certainly even South Africa, Southern Africa, if we just want to focus on the region I know well, is balancing renewables and fossil fuels, and absolutely gas needs to play more of a role. I think we're running late on time in South Africa in getting procurement processes out there and ramping up our investment in gas in the country. It's critical.
Yeah. Ryan, any further closing remarks from your side?
I think just probably echoing a lot of the comments made before, there is abundance of opportunities in Africa. I think the next few years are the time to maximize those opportunities. So making sure that we pull all the interested parties together, as people have said, and actually move away from just talking about it. There needs to be some sincere action moving forward. The whole industry is going to be buoyant, but also at the same token, I think, just echoing what I've heard over the last few months, and I'm an advocate of this now as well, about the just transition, and in fact, allowing Africa and other continents and countries to go at a pace that's going to work for them. I think I noticed one of the questions or the comments in here was about, the egos. And I think that is something as well, when we're trying to get the various sides of the table round together, that's something that could be worked upon, because I think that is a strong barrier. And maybe that's something that we work upon, and maybe that's a topic for future discussion. But really, it's just this buoyant wave is coming. There's a bull wave of projects that are going to be coming. You're starting to see them already across Africa. Let's get all parties together and be ready for this to deliver, because at the end of the day, we all deliver, we all benefit from this.
Yeah. Great. Lami, what about you? Closing thoughts? You've had quite a long time now to listen to everybody since you first spoke. What's your takeaways?
So I think my big takeaway, my closing remarks really comes down to three things: is that there is Africa needs patient capital in order to get it to where it needs to go. We need to engage with the people. And as everyone has rightly said, it's 54 countries at different junctions of this journey. And so we need to meet each one where they're at. There is a place for the diaspora to play, and I put myself in that bucket. And also there is also the, coming back to the point that Ryan just made, because it's a collegiate approach to solving a global problem. So we should be creating ecosystems and not ecosystems. And so that would really unlock the conversation, because at the moment it's a case of this versus that, good versus bad, brown and gray. And I think, recognizing that what we need is an energy mix and a combination of different solutions in order to decarbonize the need of a continent that is at the moment at a level that is really below, the starting base is so low. And so we need to bring them up. And then I think my last point is there is also a place for technology to play in terms of leveraging technology to unlock the investment opportunity, but also to create those micro and off-grid solutions that we talked about right at the very beginning as well. So I think, the dialogue is moving along, but I think we now need to see a bit more action, and each one has to really design their own strategy and roadmap to serve the people, but also to achieve a decarbonized society.
A brilliant summary. Thank you, Lami. And Samson, I think you're the last one, because Paul has had to drop off. So your final thoughts, please.
Right. What I think, overall, we need to actually recognize the identity of our potential as African nation, as African continent. We do have the potential. We do have the mineral resources. We just need to recognize that potential and be able to use it to whatever level we want to use it. Because it's still the same Africans that goes into different countries, and we can become whatever we want to be. So we need to recognize the potential and then utilize it here in our continent.
Brilliant, thank you. And then from my side, I've got a couple of ideas for future Talking Up Africa events based on what we've learned today. I think one of them is maybe to get some financiers in the room, get the sponsors, get the the banks maybe get a multilateral in the room and talk about, you know, what kind of landscape do they need to, you know, to motivate them to put money into energy in Africa. And so I think that would be an interesting one. The other one that Lamine mentioned was the technology piece, and I think renewables technology and the decarbonisation of technology in oil and gas as a topic would be really interesting for everybody. And the other one, although we might run out of episodes next year the way I'm going, but the other one we might look at is a more regional focus. So I think everybody today has recognised the 54-country problem, and maybe it would be you know, useful for everybody if we honed in on, say, the Southern African power pool and West Africa and so on, and we might get into a greater level of detail on those regional opportunities. So thank you.
Can I just make a request on just my own personal take? Is the fact that, you know, gas, you know, the next topic or one of the other topic is gas as a transition fuel to, you know, to underpin the manufacturing that is going to create jobs as we transition, right? So we don't want to burn the gas for carbon, but we need it to create the infrastructure and those pieces that are missing. And so gas as a transition fuel, I think, is still a really big part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, so it's the enabler, yeah, for sure. No, brilliant idea. Okay, well, thanks very much to all the panelists. I thought it was really great. I enjoyed it. I hope everybody else did. And yeah, we'll look forward to future events. Over to you, Belinda. I hope.
It's Claire. It's not Belinda, it's Claire. I just wanted to kindly finalise and wrap up and just say thanks very much to our member companies for taking part in this panel, our special guests for taking part in this panel, and to everyone who joined today. Please stay connected with us, and thanks very much to Stephanie, our non-exec director, for moderating today. Thanks, Stephanie, for giving me more work to do to find
Pleasure.
And more stakeholders from all over the world to participate in the next Talking Up Africa. My work never stops here at Africa Scotland Business Network. Thank you so much to everyone. Stay connected to us, and I wish you a great day further. Thank you.